April 6, 2008, Sadr City, Baghdad, 03:45 hours. Specialist James Rodriguez huddles behind a concrete barrier as an RPG screams overhead and detonates against a building behind him. The explosion showers his position with debris. His ears are ringing, his hands are shaking. He's been in combat for 6 straight hours, and the sun isn't even up yet. Rodriguez is a combat engineer with the 2nd Brigade Combat Team, 1st Cavalry Division. His job tonight is building a wall, not defending a wall, not attacking across a wall, building one, physically constructing a concrete barrier wall through the middle of an active battlefield while people are actively trying to kill him. Welcome to the Siege of Sadr City, one of the strangest and most brutal urban combat operations of the entire Iraq War. For 2 months in the spring of 2008, American forces fought a grinding battle against Jaish al-Mahdi militia, the Mahdi Army, in the densest urban terrain imaginable. 3 million people lived in Sadr City, packed into just under 4 square miles. That's population density comparable to Mumbai or Manila. And American soldiers were fighting street by street, building by building, while simultaneously constructing a 3-mile-long concrete wall that would physically divide the neighborhood. It was urban warfare at its most difficult. Enemies who blended with civilians. Narrow streets that channeled your movement, buildings that provided perfect firing positions, an enemy that knew the terrain intimately, and rules of engagement that prohibited most of the tactics that would make the mission easier, because too many civilians would die. The battle for Sadr City in 2008 killed over 1,000 Mahdi Army fighters and wounded thousands more. It killed and wounded hundreds of Iraqi civilians caught in the crossfire. It killed 10 American soldiers and wounded over 200. And it resulted in the construction of a concrete wall that became one of the most visible symbols of America's approach to counterinsurgency in Iraq, physically separating enemies from each other when you couldn't reconcile them politically. This is the story of how the U.S. Army fought and won an urban battle while literally building fortifications under fire. It's about combat engineers doing construction work while being shot at. It's about infantry clearing neighborhoods they couldn't hold. It's about the brutal calculus of urban combat where every building is a potential fortress and every street corner is a potential kill zone. This is the Siege of Sadr City. To understand why American forces were fighting in Sadr City in 2008, you need to understand what Sadr City was and who controlled it. Because this wasn't some random neighborhood, it was the heart of Shia militia power in Baghdad. Sadr City started as a slum built in the 1950s to house Baghdad's poorest Shia migrants from the south. Under Saddam Hussein, it was officially called Saddam City, but everyone knew it as a Shia stronghold, marginalized and repressed by Saddam's Sunni-dominated government. When Saddam fell in 2003, the neighborhood exploded with Shia political awakening, and it was renamed Sadr City after Mohammed Sadiq al-Sadr, a revered Shia cleric who'd been assassinated by Saddam's regime in 1999. His son, Muqtada al-Sadr, became the dominant political and military figure in the neighborhood. Young, charismatic, radical, and deeply hostile to the American occupation, Muqtada commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of poor Shia, who saw him as their protector and voice. His militia, Jaish al-Mahdi, the Mahdi Army, effectively controlled Sadr City. They provided security, they ran services, they settled disputes, they were the government in everything but name. The Americans had fought the Mahdi Army before. Twice in 2004, major battles in Sadr City and other Shia areas resulted in ceasefires that left Muqtada's power largely intact. The problem was that the Mahdi Army wasn't just a militia. It was embedded in the community, indistinguishable from the civilian population in many ways. Fighters would conduct attacks, then disappear into the neighborhoods where they lived. They'd hide weapons in mosques and schools. They'd use civilians as cover, knowing the Americans were constrained by rules of engagement. By 2008, the situation had deteriorated again. The Mahdi Army was using Sadr City as a base to launch rocket and mortar attacks into the international zone, the Green Zone, where the U.S. Embassy and Iraqi government were located. These weren't occasional harassing attacks. These were sustained bombardments. Dozens of rockets per day, 107mm and 122mm systems, launched from residential neighborhoods in Sadr City. People in the Green Zone were dying, and the attacks were undermining confidence in the Iraqi government's ability to protect its own capital. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, himself a Shia, had been tolerating the Mahdi Army for years. But by early 2008, he'd decided they were a threat to his government. In March, Iraqi forces launched operations against Shia militias in Basra in the south. The Mahdi Army responded by increasing attacks across Baghdad, particularly from Sadr City. That's when American forces got the order. Stop the rocket attacks. Secure Sadr City. Do it without causing a humanitarian catastrophe in one of Baghdad's most densely populated neighborhoods. It was an almost impossible mission, and everyone knew it. The operation began on March 25, 2008, when the 1st Cavalry Division started conducting raids and patrols into the southern edges of Sadr City. The response was immediate and violent. The Mahdi Army had spent years preparing Sadr City for defense. They had stockpiled weapons, positioned fighters, identified firing positions, created supply caches, and planned how to fight Americans in the kind of close urban terrain that negated many U.S. advantages. They had RPGs, machine guns, sniper rifles, IEDs, mortars, and most importantly, they had intimate knowledge of every street, alley, and building. When American forces pushed into southern Sadr City, they met resistance that was coordinated, sustained, and tactically sophisticated. This wasn't random insurgent attacks. This was organized urban defense by fighters who'd been planning for this battle. The combat was unlike anything most American soldiers in Iraq had experienced, and that's saying something because these were veterans of Fallujah, Ramadi, Baquba, the worst urban fights of the war. But Sadr City was different. The population density was higher, the buildings were closer together, the streets were narrower, and the enemy wasn't trying to hold ground. They were trying to inflict casualties while avoiding decisive engagement. Mahdi Army tactics were frustratingly effective. They'd wait until American patrols were deep in the neighborhood, then attack from multiple directions simultaneously. RPGs from rooftops, machine gun fire from windows, IEDs detonated remotely. The Americans would return fire, try to maneuver, call in support. But by the time they reached the firing positions, the militiamen would be gone, melted back into the civilian population. The urban terrain made traditional American advantages, air power, armor, artillery, difficult to employ. You couldn't call in airstrikes on buildings that might have civilians inside. You couldn't use tanks effectively in narrow streets choked with traffic and debris. You couldn't suppress entire neighborhoods with artillery because 1 million innocent people lived there. What you could do was grind, patrol in force, clear buildings methodically, except that you'd take casualties. Fight street by street, house by house, room by room, the way urban combat has been fought for centuries. It was slow, dangerous, exhausting work that consumed combat power without producing dramatic results. And the casualty figures reflected it. In the first week of April, multiple American soldiers were killed in Sadr City. More were wounded, some grievously. Every patrol came back with stories of near misses, of RPGs that barely missed, of ambushes that almost succeeded. The intensity was unsustainable, but stopping wasn't an option. The rockets were still hitting the green zone daily. Something had to change. The Americans needed a way to stop the attacks without getting dragged into endless urban combat that would kill soldiers and civilians while making minimal progress. That's when they decided to build a wall. The concept was elegantly simple and brutally practical. Build a concrete barrier wall along Route Gold, a major street that ran east-west through Sadr City. The wall would physically separate the southern portion of Sadr City, where the rockets were being launched from the northern portion, where the militias had their safe havens. It would be a 3-mile-long wall, 12 feet high, made from T-wall barriers that the military had been using throughout Iraq for base protection. By controlling the southern portion and blocking access from the north, American and Iraqi forces could stop the rocket attacks. The militias in northern Sadr City would be cut off from their launch positions. They could either stand and fight, which would allow American forces to destroy them in conventional combat, or they could withdraw and accept that they'd lost control of the southern area. It was counterinsurgency through physical division. If you can't reconcile the warring parties politically, you separate them physically. It wasn't elegant, but neither was urban warfare. But there was one massive problem with this plan. You had to build the wall through an active battlefield. The route the wall would follow ran right through territory the Mahdi Army contested. To build it, combat engineers would have to work in the open, placing massive concrete barriers, while militia fighters tried to kill them. And they'd have to do it for 3 miles, placing thousands of individual barriers, which would take weeks. The engineers would be working at construction speed, slow, methodical, exposed, while fighting happened at combat speed around them. They'd be operating cranes and forklifts while people shot at them with RPGs and machine guns. They'd be welding barriers together while mortars landed nearby. It was construction work conducted under combat conditions, and it would require protecting the engineers with overwhelming force every single night, because they'd be doing it at night. Working during daylight would be suicide. Too exposed, too easy for militia spotters to call in accurate fire. Night construction had its own challenges: limited visibility, more difficult crane operations, harder to spot threats, but it was the only way to make the mission survivable. The plan called for infantry to clear and secure the route ahead of the construction, establishing blocking positions and overwatch. Combat engineers would follow, placing the barriers under the protection of the infantry. Heavily armored vehicles, Bradleys and Abrams tanks, would provide fire support and intimidation. Apache helicopters would orbit overhead, ready to engage threats. And this would happen every night, pushing the wall forward a few hundred meters at a time for as long as it took to reach the full 3 miles. It was the kind of operation that looks straightforward on a map and insane when you think about the actual execution. But there wasn't a better option, so on April 10, 2008, they started building. The first night set the pattern for everything that followed. Infantry from 1st Cavalry Division pushed forward along Route Gold, clearing buildings and establishing security positions. Combat engineers moved up with their equipment, massive crane trucks capable of lifting the 12-foot-tall multi-ton concrete barriers, forklifts for positioning them, welding equipment for connecting them, generators for powering everything. The Mahdi Army attacked almost immediately. RPGs streaked out of the darkness toward the construction site. Machine gun fire raked the street. The Americans returned fire, Bradleys hammering likely firing positions with 25mm cannon fire, infantry engaging with rifles and machine guns, Apache helicopters swooping down to engage targets with Hellfire missiles and 30mm chain guns. And in the middle of this chaos, combat engineers kept working. Crane operators lifted barriers into position while tracers flew overhead. Soldiers welded connections while explosions echoed off buildings. Forklift drivers maneuvered multi-ton concrete sections through narrow streets while RPGs impacted nearby. It was surreal. Construction work happening simultaneously with intense combat. The engineers showed remarkable courage. These weren't infantry trained for close combat as their primary mission. These were soldiers whose specialty was building and demolition, suddenly finding themselves in sustained firefights while trying to do their actual job. Some engineers would be operating equipment one moment, then grabbing their rifles to return fire the next, then going back to construction when the immediate threat was neutralized. Casualties were inevitable. On April 13th, an RPG hit near a crane operator, wounding him and several nearby soldiers. On April 20th, an IED detonated near an engineer platoon, killing 2 and wounding 5. On April 28th, a sniper killed a soldier providing security for a construction site. The names and dates accumulated, each one representing a moment when someone's luck ran out in the grinding mathematics of urban combat. But the wall kept growing. Every night, a few more 100 meters of concrete barriers went up. Every morning, the Mahdi Army would wake up to find the wall had advanced further, cutting deeper into their territory. They'd attack the construction sites, but American firepower was overwhelming when they had clear targets. The militiamen who stood and fought died. The ones who survived learned to shoot and withdraw quickly, which was effective harassment, but couldn't stop the wall's steady advance. The psychological effect on both sides was significant. For the Americans, the visible progress, the lengthening wall, provided tangible evidence that they were accomplishing something, despite the casualties in the grind. You could see the mission succeeding, barrier by barrier, night by night. For the Mahdi Army, the wall was demoralizing. They were losing ground literally and visibly, and there wasn't much they could do about it. Attacking the construction sites was costly, and even successful attacks only delayed the wall slightly without stopping it. The combat itself was unlike typical Iraq war engagements because it happened in such compressed terrain. In Anbar province, fights might happen across open desert or along highways. In rural areas, you had space to maneuver. But in Sadr City, engagement ranges were sometimes less than 50 meters. You'd be taking fire from a window across the street. An RPG would come from a rooftop 1 block over. Everything was close, confined, claustrophobic. This changed how infantry operated. You couldn't use most of your weapon's maximum effective range because you couldn't see that far. Buildings blocked sightlines. You couldn't maneuver widely because streets channeled your movement. You had to clear every building systematically because any window might have a fighter with an RPG. The tactics were more similar to World War II urban combat than to most Iraq war operations. Bradleys and Abrams tanks became absolutely essential. Their armor could survive RPG hits that would destroy lighter vehicles. Their firepower could suppress entire buildings. They could punch through walls when necessary, creating new routes or escape paths, and their presence intimidated militia fighters, who knew they couldn't effectively engage armor with small arms or even RPGs unless they got perfect shots at weak points. But armor wasn't invulnerable. On April 17th, an Abrams tank hit a massive IED, several hundred pounds of explosives buried in the street. The explosion flipped the 70-ton tank, killing 2 crew members and wounding the others. It was a stark reminder that even the heaviest armor could be vulnerable to well-prepared defenses. Apache helicopters provided critical support, circling overhead with thermal imaging that could detect fighters on rooftops or in buildings. When militia positions were identified, the Apaches could engage with precision. Hellfire missiles for buildings, 30mm cannon fire for individual fighters. The presence of Apaches overhead changed militia behavior dramatically. They'd hear the helicopters and immediately break off attacks, knowing the Apaches could kill them from ranges they couldn't even see. But helicopter operations in dense urban terrain had their own risks. Buildings limited maneuverability. Power lines and other obstacles created hazards. And the militias had some anti-aircraft weapons, mostly heavy machine guns and RPGs used in anti-aircraft mode. On May 3rd, an Apache took multiple hits from ground fire and had to make an emergency landing. The crew survived, but the incident showed that even air support wasn't risk-free. The infantry did the hardest work, clearing buildings, establishing security positions, providing overwatch for the engineers, fighting at close range when ambushed. They'd stack up outside a building, breach the door, clear room by room, then move to the next building. Some buildings were empty, some had civilians who were terrified and angry about armed Americans invading their homes. Some had militia fighters who'd fight briefly then try to escape out back doors or windows. The rules of engagement created constant dilemmas. You'd take fire from a building and couldn't immediately return fire with heavy weapons because there might be civilians inside. You'd spot military-age males watching your movements and couldn't engage them unless they were holding weapons or committing hostile acts. The militia exploited these constraints ruthlessly, using civilians as shields and operating from residential buildings that they knew the Americans were reluctant to destroy. Some soldiers became extraordinarily good at urban combat through repetition. After clearing hundreds of buildings, you developed instincts about which doorways were dangerous, which windows provided the best firing positions, which alleys were likely ambush points. These veterans would lead their squads with hard-won expertise, making split-second tactical decisions that kept people alive. Others struggled. The intensity and duration of operations in Sadr City caused psychological strain that manifested in various ways. Some soldiers became hyper-aggressive, seeing threats everywhere. Others became cautious to the point of paralysis. Some developed superstitions and rituals. The mental health impact of sustained urban combat was significant, though it often wasn't apparent until soldiers returned home and the adrenaline wore off. By late April, the wall was over halfway complete, stretching more than 1.5 miles through Sadr City. The southern portion was increasingly under American and Iraqi government control. The rocket attacks on the Green Zone had decreased significantly, not stopped entirely, but reduced from dozens per day to occasional harassment. Militia resistance was weakening as their best fighters were killed and their supply lines were disrupted. But the Mahdi Army wasn't defeated and they weren't surrendering. In late April and early May, they conducted several large-scale counterattacks, attempting to overrun American positions and destroy sections of the wall. These attacks were costly failures. When militia fighters massed for conventional assaults, American firepower destroyed them. The survivors retreated, leaving dozens of bodies in the streets. The political situation was evolving too. Muqtada al-Sadr, watching his militia get systematically destroyed, was under pressure from his own supporters and from Iranian backers who wanted the fighting to stop. The Iraqi government was gaining confidence that they could control Sadr City without triggering all-out civil war, and the Americans were proving that they could impose military solutions when political solutions failed. On May 11, 2008, the wall was completed. 3 miles of 12-foot-high concrete barriers now divided Sadr City, running from west to east along Route Gold. The southern portion, where the rocket launch sites had been, was under control. The northern portion remained in militia hands, but they no longer had access to the southern areas or easy routes to launch attacks on the Green Zone. It had taken exactly 1 month to build. 1 month of nightly construction under fire, 1 month of sustained urban combat, 1 month of grinding casualties and incremental progress. The official numbers at the end of the operation were sobering. 10 American soldiers killed in action, over 200 wounded. Mahdi Army casualties were estimated at over 1,000 killed and thousands more wounded. Civilian casualties, always the hardest to count accurately, numbered in the hundreds dead and thousands displaced. The wall stood as a physical barrier and a political statement. The Iraqi government had asserted control over part of Sadr City. The Americans had demonstrated they could impose military solutions in even the most difficult urban terrain, and the Mahdi Army had learned that challenging the U.S. military in sustained combat was a losing proposition. But completing the wall wasn't the end of the battle. It was more like the end of the first phase. The southern portion of Sadr City still needed to be secured completely, services restored, and governance established. And the militia in the northern portion hadn't disappeared. They'd just been cut off. Throughout May and June, American and Iraqi forces conducted clearing operations in southern Sadr City, building by building, block by block. These operations were less intense than the initial fighting, but still dangerous. Militia fighters remaining in the southern area either fought and were killed, or tried to escape north across the wall, or blended back into the civilian population. The wall itself became a source of controversy. Iraqi civilians in Sadr City saw it as collective punishment, a literal barrier imposed by Americans and the government that divided their neighborhood. It made daily life harder. Crossing from one part of Sadr City to another required going through checkpoints, showing identification, being searched. Markets and families were divided. The symbolism of a wall built by foreign forces through an Iraqi neighborhood was politically toxic. American commanders understood this but argued the wall was necessary. The rocket attacks had been unacceptable. The militia control of Sadr City had been unacceptable. The wall was a military solution to a military problem, and once the security situation stabilized, political solutions could be pursued. Whether you agreed with this logic depended largely on whether you prioritized immediate security or long-term political legitimacy. By late summer 2008, the situation in Sadr City had fundamentally changed. The intense urban combat of April and May had ended. The rocket attacks on the Green Zone had virtually stopped. Iraqi security forces had taken over much of the security responsibility, with American forces in supporting roles. Services were being restored, markets were reopening, and something resembling normal life was returning to the southern portion. Muqtada al-Sadr remained a political force, but his militia had been badly damaged. Many of his best commanders and fighters were dead. His ability to challenge the Iraqi government militarily had been degraded. He'd eventually shift toward more political engagement and less militia activity, a transformation that the battle for Sadr City had helped force. The lessons from Sadr City were studied intensively by the U.S. military because urban combat was becoming increasingly common, and this operation illustrated both what worked and what didn't. What worked was overwhelming force applied persistently. The Americans committed substantial combat power to Sadr City. Multiple battalions, armor, artillery, helicopters, drones. They maintained operational tempo, even when taking casualties, refusing to let the militia dictate the pace. This grinding pressure eventually broke militia resistance. What worked was protecting your vulnerable assets, the combat engineers, with layered security. Infantry clearing ahead, armor providing fire support, helicopters overhead, drones providing surveillance. The construction could continue because the security was comprehensive. What worked was adapting to the urban terrain instead of fighting against it, using armor in close support, clearing buildings methodically, accepting that you couldn't use all your firepower because of civilian considerations. Fighting the enemy's fight because that's where the enemy was. What didn't work was trying to minimize your presence or footprint. Some counterinsurgency theory emphasized light footprints and minimal force. Sadr City showed that sometimes you need maximum force, persistent presence, and willingness to impose military solutions. The wall was the opposite of a light footprint. It was a massive, permanent physical imposition. But it worked. What didn't work was expecting quick victories. The battle took 2 months of sustained operations. It wasn't a decisive raid or a dramatic assault. It was a grind, accepting daily casualties to achieve incremental progress. That kind of operation requires institutional patience and willingness to accept costs, which is politically difficult, but sometimes militarily necessary. What didn't work was ignoring the political dimensions. The wall solved a military problem, but created political resentment that persisted for years. The civilians of Sadr City paid a price for the battle that they didn't choose. The long-term costs of those political wounds are harder to measure than casualties, but no less real. The siege of Sadr City never became as famous as Fallujah or as symbolic as the surge's success in Anbar province. It happened later in the war when American attention was fading, and it was complicated by the fact that the enemy was Shia militias rather than Sunni insurgents, which didn't fit the dominant narrative of the war. But for the soldiers who fought there, it was one of the most intense urban combat experiences of the Iraq War. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the combat engineer we started with, survived the siege of Sadr City. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel from an RPG, once by an IED blast, but neither injury was serious enough to evacuate him. He finished his deployment, completed his enlistment, and went home to Texas. Years later, in interviews with Iraq War veterans, he described Sadr City as the most surreal experience of his military career. "We were building a wall while people tried to kill us," he said. "That sentence sounds insane, but that was the mission, and we did it. Every night we put up more barriers, and eventually we built the whole damn thing. I'm still not sure if that was brave or stupid or both, but we got it done." That ambiguity, brave or stupid, necessary or excessive, success or Pyrrhic victory, characterizes the siege of Sadr City. The military objectives were achieved. The rockets stopped. The militia was defeated. The wall was built. But the costs were high, the political effects were mixed, and the question of whether there were better alternatives will never be definitively answered. What's undeniable is that American soldiers accomplished an extraordinarily difficult mission under terrible conditions. They fought urban combat against a determined enemy in dense terrain while simultaneously conducting construction operations. They took casualties and kept working. They adapted to conditions that negated many of their advantages and still found ways to win. The wall still stands, though its significance has changed. It's no longer the front line of active combat. Sadr City has been peaceful for years. Some sections have been removed to ease civilian movement, but it remains a concrete reminder of the spring of 2008 when American combat engineers built fortifications under fire and won a grinding urban battle that most people have forgotten. For military historians, Sadr City represents an important case study in urban warfare. For soldiers who fought there, it represents 2 months of their lives they'll never forget and can never quite explain to people who weren't there. For Iraqi civilians who lived through it, it represents violence and disruption imposed on their neighborhood in a war they didn't start. And for the American military, it represents a strange kind of success, a tactical victory achieved through adaptation, persistence, and willingness to accept costs in a war where tactical victories often meant less than strategic and political outcomes. The siege of Sadr City wasn't the beginning of the Iraq War or the end. It was one battle among thousands, lasting 2 months in a war that lasted 8 years. But it was a battle that tested American forces in ways few others did, required solutions that were improvised and unorthodox, and demonstrated both the capabilities and the limitations of the most powerful military in the world, operating in the most difficult urban terrain imaginable. That's worth remembering, not to glorify war or celebrate violence, but to understand what happened, what it cost, and what it taught. The soldiers who built that wall under fire deserve to have their story told, even if it's complicated, even if the war they fought in remains controversial, even if the victory they won was incomplete. They did their job under impossible conditions. They built a 3-mile wall through an active battlefield. They fought urban combat every night for 2 months. They lost friends and kept fighting. That's the siege of Sadr City. That's the story of the wall.